Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's Vigilant Software webinar. I'm glad that you're able to join us on the second of a series of 4 webinars which are looking at information security risk assessment and ISO 27001. For those of you who've been on our first webinar or other webinars run by our organization, you'll know that I'm Alan Calder. I'm the Chief Executive and founder of Vigilant Software. I've been in the world of information security management since Steve Watkins and I led the world's first certification to what was then called BS 7799 and is now ISO 27001, the Information Security Management System standard. And I was involved in the original specification for VS Risk and continue to have an input into the ongoing development plans for the product, which has a series of planned improvements and increases in functionality built into the roadmap for the next 12 to 18 months, so that we can ensure we've built the roadmaps that we can ensure that we get regular feedback from customers and users and reflect the changing risk and business environment in a way which ensures that our clients are able to continue getting the best out of the product. This webinar, which is the second in the educational series, is designed to take you all on a learning journey, which started off with talking last week about why ISO 27001 is an appropriate management system for any organization in today's world where intellectual capital and information are the key assets of any organization, and where the growing number of governance, risk management and compliance requirements set standards on organizations and thresholds for engaging in contracts with clients, which can often be dealt with by arriving at ISO 27001 certification. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of risk management, what the key steps in risk management are. Next week the webinar will look at the execution of a risk assessment using VS Risk, and then finally we'll be looking at how you go about maintaining or updating your risk assessment with VS Risk. One of the advantages of using a database software product like VS Risk is that updating and maintaining the assessment is an awful lot simpler than it is if you have everything in a spreadsheet. Of course, not having everything in a spreadsheet means that you don't get to tear your hair out, but we kind of assume that what you'd like to do is have an easier, more practical way of setting up and managing your information security management system. So this seminar today is 20 to 30 minutes in total. You will have noticed that you are muted on entry into the webinar. That's because the amount of background noise there is can be very disturbing for folk on the webinar. But if you have questions or points that you'd like to raise, please do use the chat function or the Q&A function, which is built into the GoToWebinar panel, which sits alongside your screen. We're paying attention to the chat function and messages that come up there. We're paying attention to the Q&A, so please do feel free to trigger us anything that you've got in the way of questions. Where there are questions, what we'll do is we will answer them. We'll pick up and answer them at the end of the webinar. So what we'll do is we'll read out the question so everybody knows what the question was, and I'll then share the answer with everybody so everybody knows what's going on, and that'll keep us going through the process. So really, just to recap, last week we looked at what information security is. If you remember, I defined information security as the combination of attributes of an information asset: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we talked about an information security management system, or ISMS, as the framework and structure which ensures that you have a robust and systematic approach to ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CI&A of your information assets. ISO IEC 27001 is the international specification for an ISMS, which can be used for management to audit its own management system. It can be used by a second party, a client or a supplier, to audit a management system, and it can be used by a third party, an accredited certification body, to carry out an audit of an ISMS. And you and your organization would care about ISO 27001 certification because increasingly it's a contractual requirement, a hoop that you have to jump through as part of seeking to contract with public sector or private sector organizations. It's built into RFPs and RFQs, now increasingly standard basis. It's a way of demonstrating that your management system and your approach to managing information risks has taken all appropriate steps to protect them, and that can demonstrate compliance with, for instance, the Data Protection Act and a number of other similar compliance frameworks. Before we talk about information security risk assessment, it's worthwhile just running through some of the key definitions. You can have a long discussion about what words should mean, but for an ISMS to work, it's sensible just simply to pin down exactly what you want words to mean, and so I've picked the definitions out of ISO 27001. They're common to the whole ISO 27000 family of standards. Information security, as I said earlier, is the preservation of the C, I, and A of information. Confidentiality is the property that information is not made available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals, while integrity is the property of safeguarding accuracy and completeness of assets, and of course availability is the property of being accessible and usable on demand by an authorized entity. And you'll remember that I spoke about the C, I, and A as being like the legs of a stool. If one of them's unequal in length to the others, the stool's very uncomfortable or impossible to sit on. And the same thing applies with C, I, and A in information security terms. If you get the mix between those three attributes wrong, your information security management system doesn't work so well. We speak about C, I, and A of information assets. An asset is defined very broadly as anything that has value to the organization. In other words, it's not something which is on the finance department's fixed asset register. It's anything that has value to the organization. That brings us on to the issue of risk. If we're going to look at risk assessment, we need to know exactly how we define risk. And a risk exists where there is an identified likelihood of an identified threat exploiting an identified vulnerability in relation to the C, I, or A of an asset, and where that compromise will have a quantifiable impact on the organization. And you see from that that you must know what asset is threatened. You must be able to identify the threat. You must be able to work out which vulnerability the threat will exploit. When you can do those and you can assess how likely it is that the threat will exploit the vulnerability, then you have the basis for estimating risk. If you can't identify the actual threat, if you can't work out what vulnerability it might exploit, then there is no way of working out the likelihood of that thing happening, and therefore without likelihood there is no risk. Very core definition for your ISMS. Likelihood and impact, the cost to the organization of losing the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of that asset is fundamental to the definition of a risk. A risk assessment is therefore the activity involved in identifying what risks there might be to assets inside the organization. And we often talk about risk assessment as being the core competence of information security management. And it's the core competence because under ISO 27001, you don't select information security control without having first identified a specific risk which applies to a specific asset. And if you remember what I said about risks, the risk is because risk exists because there is a likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability and a quantifiable impact if it were to do so. ISO 27001 explicitly says that a risk assessment should be carried out before any controls are selected and implemented. Every control which you select should be justified through the risk assessment, and that the PlanDoCheckAct model should apply through the risk assessment process in just the same way as it applies through the overall design and implementation of the management system in the first place. I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, as we go through, some of you are finding that you may have questions you want to ask. Please do just at any time feel free to type them into the chat function or the Q&A function. We'll pick up any questions that there are at the end of this webinar, and we'll make sure they're all answered for you. So the PlanDoCheckAct cycle, which drives risk assessments, is the heart of management systems today. It starts with the basic idea that you plan what you do, then you do it, you check that it's delivering the results that you wanted to, and then you take steps, you act in order to close the gap between what you'd planned and what actually happened. So PlanDoCheckAct, the deeming cycle, as it's still broadly known as, is the heart of management systems and is the heart of risk assessment. You plan your risk assessment, you carry out your risk assessment, you check that you've effectively identified the risks that there are and selected appropriate controls to bring the risk down to an acceptable level, and then you take action to deal with those areas where it's clear there is a residual risk that still needs to be dealt with. So a risk assessment, therefore, is a process of identifying the threat vulnerability combinations that have the likelihood of impacting integrity, availability, or confidentiality of each and every asset within the scope of a management system, of information security management system. ISO 27001 says you should carry out this risk assessment from a business compliance and contractual perspective. In other words, you need to ensure that where there are specific business requirements, you take those into account. They may be different from your compliance requirements, and they may be different from your contractual requirements. So for instance, you may, from a business point of view, need to make information about staff in your training team available to a number of your clients, whereas from a compliance point of view, you may need to make sure that you protect personal information to the point where the data is not at risk and is not shared without the permission of the data owners. There could be conflicts between those. Your risk assessment is intended to take those types of conflicts into account. Not only does ISO 27001 require a risk assessment to be carried out, and so you do it to meet the requirements of the standard, but there are very straightforward good business reasons for doing so. The first is that if you've identified the impact of a compromise to an asset, you can determine how much it would be sensible to spend on avoiding the compromise. And how much it's sensible to spend is a part of what's called your risk appetite, how much risk you can bear to take. And getting the right balance between the harm that will occur to the organization and the cost of avoiding the harm is at the heart of making risk management an effective part of managing the organization as a whole. Not only does that enable you to reduce expenditure where you don't need to, but where you might be overspending on a control, you can take that money and reallocate it to an area that is less well protected. So risk assessment can be an effective method of ensuring that you're getting a good balance of your spend across the whole of the management system. And because your control selections and therefore your information security management system decisions are made on the basis of an objective assessment of risk, what you've got is an objective information security management system, one in which you can explain to some staff why they can't have access to certain types of data under certain conditions without it being clearly the whim of whoever owns those assets. So looked at graphically, the information security risk management process is broken down into the analysis phase. You look at, you identify assets, you look for threats, you look for vulnerabilities that might exploit those threats, and where there is a likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability, then you have identified a risk. You've completed the analysis stage, and you can then move on to looking for appropriate countermeasures, safeguards, controls. They're all mean the same thing, which you can apply to that risk in order to bring the risk down to a level that you're happy with. Just a brief word about assets. In doing the risk assessment, one of the Annex A controls in ISO 27001 is that you should do asset management. You should consider creating and maintaining an asset register. ISO 27002 in Clause 7 talks about what might go into your asset register. But certainly in terms of the inventory of assets, you're likely to be looking at all of the physical computing resources, whether that's boxes, tin boxes, or PDAs, or printers, or switches. They're all physical computing resources. Certainly that would include buildings, data centers, offices, secure environments in which you use hardware. There will be telephones, increasingly mobile phones and PDAs. You're going to have operating systems. You're going to have information assets, not just databases, but also applications, intellectual property. There will be storage facilities for hard information as well as soft information, and of course people are assets. They certainly wouldn't want to be told they were owned by the organization, but people are assets, as indeed are processes. They're some of the core assets on which organizations today depend to be effective in the marketplace. So in putting together your asset documentation, and VS Risk enables you to do this effectively. It enables you to upload, for instance, from a spreadsheet or a CSV file, details of all of the assets that you want to include in your risk assessment and which might be subject to the management system scope that you've selected. A couple of the key steps in key types of controls that one tends to select in terms of asset management, and which again is built into VS Risk. The first is responsibility for assets. In other words, you can determine who should own the asset, who's the person going to be who's responsible for identifying and running the controls which are selected. Information classification, the determination of whether the information is confidential, top secret, or whatever your classification system is. And it's the labeling of assets which enable people to know what circumstances they can be deployed in. So, for instance, a collection of highly confidential papers would probably be colored differently than papers which are available for common consumption. Information that is highly confidential might be encrypted, whereas information which is available for general usage might not be encrypted. You'd also have classification, information classification as a way of dealing with sensitivity guidelines, particularly sensitivity around personal information. There are some types of personal information which have to be protected to a higher level than other types, and in all of those cases what ISO 27001 and supported by 27002 does is enable you to identify how to do that and how to select and apply appropriate labels that ensure that people can identify how a particular information asset should be treated. So as I said, the objective of risk assessment is to ensure that you've got a proper balance between having enough in the way of safeguards and you're avoiding doing the things that will get in the way of achieving the business objectives. So risk assessment is trying to get a proper balance between safeguards against loss and risk of failing to meet business objectives. And the key areas that your risk assessment is helping you look at is when you've got it right, you've got the flavor and the heat of the controls just about right, is where removing safeguards that you have in place will increase the risk, but putting more safeguards in place will simply increase the cost of protecting that asset without improving security. And because information security risk assessment enables you to get that kind of neat balance between expenditure and security and the size of a contingency, it enables you to justify what you need to spend on information security management in a practical way. Finally, ISO 27001 says that any risk assessment must have an approach which ensures comparable and reproducible results. What that means is, and this is fundamental to why you would choose a risk assessment tool rather than try and do the job yourself, is that somebody else needs to be able to pick up the risk assessment you've done, be able to see exactly what you've done, go through the same steps that you went through and arrive at exactly the same conclusion that you arrived at. That's what reproducible means. Comparable means that if someone else takes or you take a similar asset and you put it through the risk assessment process, you'll arrive at pretty similar conclusions about exposure and about appropriate controls to put in. In other words, there's no room for subjectivity inside a proper risk assessment, and in many traditional Excel and similar approaches to risk assessment, there is a lot of subjectivity combined with quite a lot of danger around cells being mismapped, plus of course all the time. What VS Risk does is automates that. It enables you to select your risk acceptance criteria in a way that enables your level of risk acceptance to impact all of the risks that you're accepting, all of the risks that you're considering, in a way which ensures that your control selection decisions are consistent across the whole of the ISMS. And in making those controls, you really go through the 4 steps which are basic to any risk management. The first is, do we accept the risk? In other words, we live with the risk without applying controls. The second is that we avoid the risk. We eliminate it by workaround or by some other arrangements. The third is that we transfer the risk to a third party. This is obviously risk of impact, not likelihood, to a third party by means of insurance usually, or you apply controls to bring the risk down, to mitigate the risk and bring it down to an acceptable level. ISO 27001 certification is a way of telling your clients that you've carried out a risk assessment and selected controls on the basis of your risk appetite and on the basis of a structured and robust, resilient approach to risk management. And what that tells them is that your management systems, your information management systems are safe and secure, and that your organization is a robust and sensible one for them to deal with. It also enables them to arrive at that conclusion without simply having to take your word for it, because they can look at a third-party independent certificate generated by an organization that has had zero involvement in your preparation for certification audits. In other words, if you use a consultancy organization like IT governance, or you use tools and products from IT governance, what you can rely on and your clients can rely on is that we won't also be providing certification services or assessment services. Those are provided properly by an independent accredited certification body who, when they give you a certificate, are giving you something that third parties right the way around the world are able to rely on. So in summary, and just to remind you, if you have questions, please do pose them using the chat function or the question function in the GoToWebinar tool set. Information security risk analysis is not a straightforward activity. There's a number of steps in it. It's quite complicated. It's very repetitive. There are a number of things you do over and over and over again, but it gets easier to do as your knowledge of your environment and your asset base gets embedded. There are many risk management approaches, but ISO 27001, while recognizing that any one of those could be interesting, simply says that a risk assessment methodology must go through the threat, vulnerability, likelihood, impact, select controls in order to mitigate risk. Those steps are common to any risk management methodology, and they're at the heart of how VS Risk is built and designed. And really, how to carry out a risk assessment using VS Risk is the subject of next week's webinar. We're planning to kick that off at 4 o'clock on Thursday, May the 23rd. That's 4 o'clock UK, currently British summertime, although for those of you not in the UK, it's currently winter here. So 4 o'clock officially BST next Thursday, May the 23rd, followed on the Thursday after that, the Thursday just before the end of the month by the fourth webinar, which is about maintaining and updating your risk assessment using VS Risk. And if you haven't registered for either of those, you can register for both of them by going to the webinar link on Vigilant Software, www.vigilantsoftware.co.uk/webinars.aspx. And if you haven't already downloaded a free trial of VS Risk, I'd like to encourage you to do that. You can download and install and have 15 days virtually full usage of a tool that will automate and give you a compliant ISO 27001 risk assessment. And the other thing might be to buy a copy of 9 Steps to Success, which is my book on how to do ISO 27001 in 9 straightforward steps. It's quite a straightforward book, and again you can purchase that off of the Vigilant Software website. Either of those are sensible things to do if you're looking at progressing your interest in VS Risk. And if you want to know more about ISO 27001, including how to carry out a ISO 27001 compliant risk assessment, please do log on to Vigilant Software. Please do come back to the next set of webinars, which are due to come up over the course of the next 2 weeks, as I indicated. And that brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to the end of what I was planning to say about risk assessment today. And so I'm happy to take questions if people have questions, either through the chat function or through the Q&A. So my first question is, are there any procedures available to help in determining whether a measure to be put in place will be too strict to make the business processes too bureaucratic? And the answer to that question, and it's a very good question, the answer to that question is that it depends very much on the organization. There are some organizations in which a level of bureaucracy is reflective of their risk appetite. They're very cautious, and so they want procedures to be very tight and very pinned down. There are other organizations where the risk appetite is quite substantial, and they will look for very limited procedures and very limited controls. And it's really in the light of what the risk appetite is that you need to determine what an appropriate level of detail in a control should be. For that reason, there are no firm guidelines on what's appropriate, because what's appropriate depends on the risk appetite of each and every organization that's doing the risk assessment. So other questions, as I say, please do feel free to put them in through the chat function or through the Q&A function. A couple of other questions that have come in. Is a risk assessment reusable in different circumstances? Again, once you've done a risk assessment, the risk assessment is the basis for your selection of controls, and so you want to maintain the details of the risk assessment you carried out, because, for instance, an external auditor will want to be able to work back from the selected control to see why it was selected. You can it's not unusual inside the detail of a risk assessment to identify that similar threat vulnerability combinations apply to more than one asset. But certainly, I may have misunderstood your question, Hakeem, but the risk assessment, you've done it, it remains in place as one of the core supporting records of how you selected your controls. How can you assert that the organization is safe and secure is another reasonable question. What you're asserting is that the organization has in place an information security management system that's been externally assessed against a public standard and has been certified as being in compliance with that standard. And you can therefore say that in that particular way, the organization, its information assets are safe and secure. They're managed within an externally certified information security management system. Detailed inventory, is that needed at the start or not? And that's a good question. Quite often people think that I think it's necessary to include every single laptop as a separate information asset inside the organization. That's not actually the case. You can, for instance, look at a collection of laptops as a single asset. But certainly, whether you're looking at groups of assets that face similar threats with similar likelihoods of similar vulnerabilities being compromised, then you can treat those assets as groups, those groups as a single asset. Whether you're looking at assets on that basis or more detailed levels of assets, yes, you certainly do need to identify ahead of your information security risk assessment process. You do need to identify all of the assets that are within the scope of your planned management system. If the organization doesn't have a data asset register, can ISO 27001 take place? Essentially, no, it can't. You have to be able to identify the assets that are within the scope of your ISMS, and that means that you need to list them, and that list is often just simply called an asset register. You don't need to have a lot of other detailed information. It might be useful to, but you need to list all of the assets, and for each of the assets you need to be able to identify an owner, and you need to be able to identify what the appropriate controls are for that asset. So yes, it is a core part. For an organization that encourages innovation, ISO 27001 compliance may be a serious issue. How does one balance it? I would disagree. I would say ISO 27001 compliance is a seriously useful thing to do because it ensures that in an innovative organization you don't expose yourself to information security risk. We as an organization, Vigilant Software and our parent company, IT Governance, are extremely innovative. We launch new products and services virtually every day. We're growing at around about 50% per annum. And for us, one of the major benefits of an ISMS is that we've got in place a very simple and robust process for ensuring that everything we do is not going to expose our critical and valuable information assets to risk. So I would say that ISO 27001, an innovative organization, is probably more important than it is in a slow-moving and an inactive organization. So yeah, for those of you who are wondering how to ask a question, it's the Q&A function or the chat function, either of those. Just simply type your question in. It looks as though we're kind of coming to the end of questions now. I'm perfectly happy to answer any more that you may have, and either to answer them through the chat function, or indeed you're welcome to email us after this webinar through servicecenter@vigilantsoftware.co.uk, and any questions that you've got we will certainly respond to and share with you. Yes, it kind of looks like that's all of the questions which we've got in for today, ladies and gentlemen. So I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you all for joining the webinar. I hope it's been useful to you. We're going to be looking next week at the actual steps involved in carrying out a webinar, and that means that our product manager, Phil Hare, will be online doing a live demonstration of the use of VS-Risk 1.7, our new version of VS-Risk. We have updates and improvements coming out on a regular basis, and so clients who take our service pack as part of their purchase are able to benefit from those as on a continual improvement basis. If you don't have a version of VS-Risk yet to demo, please, I encourage you to download it and have a try. And otherwise, what I look forward to welcoming you all back to the third in this webinar series a week today on Thursday the 23rd, on Thursday the 23rd of March. And until then, I hope you have a very successful week. Thank you for your time today, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.